The house is breathing. I don't mean that in a metaphorical way, like it's an old house and it settles and creaks. I know all about that. I've lived here for 7 years. I know the groan the pipes make in the winter and the way the floorboards in the upstairs hallway pop when the afternoon sun hits them just right. I know the sound of the wind as it combs through the dense Douglas firs that surround the property, a sound like a distant ocean. Those are the normal sounds, the comforting sounds. This is different. Right now, it's 3 in the morning and I'm sitting on the edge of my bed, completely rigid, listening. And the house is breathing. It's a slow, deep, impossibly soft inhalation that seems to come from the walls themselves. It holds for a count of 4, and then a long, slow exhale that I can feel more than hear. A subtle vibration through the floorboards, a whisper of air from the heating vent beside my bed. It's the exact rhythm of my own breathing when I'm trying to fall asleep. It's mimicking me, and I've been holding my own breath for over a minute, listening to it continue without me. 7 years ago, buying this place felt like the smartest decision I'd ever made. It wasn't some gothic, imposing mansion. It was a simple two-story house built in the late 60s, solid and unassuming, set on 5 acres of wooded land in a quiet corner of Washington state. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down a gravel road, just far enough for complete privacy, but not so far that you felt like you'd fallen off the face of the earth. For me, a freelance graphic designer who had grown profoundly tired of city life, it was perfect. My work was remote, my social circle had dwindled to a few friends I spoke with online, and my tolerance for traffic and noise had hit absolute zero. I craved silence. I craved solitude. The house became my sanctuary. The first floor was an open-plan living room and kitchen, with a big picture window that looked out onto a sea of green ferns and dark, ancient trees. Upstairs was my bedroom and a spare room I converted into a home office. My routine was simple and repetitive, a comforting loop I rarely broke. I'd wake up with the sun, make coffee in the quiet kitchen, and watch the morning fog burn off the trees. I'd work until about 5, my only company the rhythmic tap of my stylus on my tablet and the low hum of my computer. In the evenings, I'd read or watch old movies or just sit on the back porch and listen to the world settle into night. Silence was the best part. Not a true, absolute silence, of course, but a natural one. It was a canvas of quiet onto which the little sounds of the house and the forest were painted, the drip of rain from the eaves after a storm, the scuttling of some small creature in the attic, the low thrum of the refrigerator cycling on. For years, these sounds were my companions. They were predictable, reliable. They meant I was home and I was safe. I was alone, but I was never lonely. The house was enough. It had its own personality, its own language, and I had learned to understand it. We had a rhythm, the house and I an unspoken agreement. I would care for it, and it would shelter me. That agreement, I now realize, was a foolish assumption. The house had its own terms. I just hadn't heard them yet. The first time it happened, it was so small, so insignificant, that I barely registered it. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The sky was a solid slab of gray, and a cold, persistent rain was falling, blurring the world outside my office window into a watercolor of greens and browns. I was on a tight deadline for a client, a notoriously picky branding project that was sucking the life out of me. I'd been staring at the same logo variation for 3 hours, and my brain felt like a wrung-out sponge. Frustration finally boiled over. I pushed my chair back from the desk, the wheels rumbling on the hardwood floor, and let out a long, heavy sigh of pure exhaustion. "I can't do this," I whispered to the empty room. And that's when it happened. From the hallway just outside my open office door came a sound. It was the slow, drawn-out creak of a single floorboard, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times before. But this time it was different. It had the same cadence, the same weary, descending pitch as my own sigh. It was a perfect echo, rendered in groaning wood. I froze, my head cocked, listening. Nothing, just the drumming of the rain and the hum of my computer. I stood up and walked into the hallway, my socks whispering on the floor. I looked down at the spot where the sound had come from. I put my foot on that specific board and pressed down. It creaked, sure, but it was a quick, sharp protest. I couldn't replicate the long, sighing sound I had just heard. I shook my head, a small, nervous laugh escaping my lips. "You're just tired, Alex," I told myself. "It's an old house. The humidity is high because of the rain. It's just the wood settling." It was a coincidence, a perfect, oddly timed coincidence. I went back to my desk, took a deep breath, and forced myself to focus on the logo. But for the rest of the afternoon, a small, cold knot of unease sat in my stomach. The house had never done that before. A week or so went by and nothing else happened. The memory of the sighing floorboard faded, relegated to the file in my brain labeled "weird things that happen when you're sleep-deprived." The project was finished, the client was happy, and my life returned to its placid, predictable rhythm. Then came the tapping. I was working late one night. It was past midnight, and the only light in the entire house was the glow of my monitor. The rain had started again, a gentle, hypnotic patter on the roof. I was in a state of deep focus, a rare and productive flow, my hand moving quickly with the stylus, my mind lost in the digital canvas. Tap, tap, tappity tap. The sound of the plastic tip on the screen was the only sharp sound in the room. Then another sound joined it. It came from the large window to my left. Tap, tap, tappity tap. It was faint, barely audible over the rain. I stopped working, my hand hovering over the tablet. I listened. The rain continued its steady rhythm. I went back to work. Tap, tap, tap. I heard it again, coming from the window. Tap, tap, tap. It was matching my own movements, beat for beat. I slowly, deliberately tapped my stylus on the tablet 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. From the window, a beat later, came the reply. Tap, 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 tap. A tiny, distinct sound like a fingernail on cold glass. My blood went cold. I wasn't just hearing things, that was a response. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I slowly swiveled my chair to face the window. It was a black, reflective void. All I could see was the reflection of my own pale, terrified face and my dimly lit office behind me. The rain slid down the glass in wavering, distorted lines. I told myself it had to be a branch, a twig blown by the wind tapping against the pane in a bizarrely rhythmic way. It had to be. I got up, my legs feeling unsteady, and walked to the window. I peered out, pressing my face close to the glass, but I couldn't see anything in the oppressive darkness. The nearest tree branch was a good 10 feet away, motionless. The wind wasn't even blowing that hard. I stood there for a long time, just watching the blackness, my breath fogging the glass. The tapping didn't come back. I eventually went back to my desk, but the creative flow was gone, replaced by a jittery, raw-edged anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there in the dark, listening to the small sounds of my life and learning to talk back. I ended up shutting down my computer and going to bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the rain, and for the first time in 7 years, the sounds of my house didn't feel comforting. They felt observant. The incidents began to accumulate like collecting stones. Each one was small, pebble-sized, and on its own, easily dismissed. But together, they started to feel heavy. A few days after the tapping, I was in the kitchen making lunch, feeling a wave of melancholy wash over me for no particular reason. It was just one of those gray, aimless afternoons. I was thinking about my ex, Sarah, and how long it had been since I'd really had a meaningful connection with anyone. A profound sense of loneliness settled on me like a shroud. At that exact moment, the temperature in the kitchen plummeted. It wasn't a draft. All the windows were closed. It was a sudden, oppressive cold that seemed to emanate from the very air, sinking into my bones. The hair on my arm stood on end. I glanced at the thermostat on the wall. It still read 68 degrees, but I could see my breath, a faint white puff in the air. The cold lasted for maybe a minute, a pocket of Arctic air in my warm kitchen, and then, as quickly as it came, it dissipated, leaving me shivering and utterly bewildered. I tried to rationalize it, a weird atmospheric event, a problem with the insulation. But I couldn't ignore the timing. It had happened the very instant I'd been consumed by sadness. The house was reacting to my emotions. The thought was so absurd that I tried to laugh it off, but the fear was real. I started to pay closer attention, to watch for the connections. I began to feel like a scientist in a terrifying, uncontrolled experiment where I was both the observer and the subject. One evening, I was watching a comedy special on my laptop, sitting on the couch in the living room. I let out a loud, genuine laugh at a joke. The moment the sound left my lips, a loud pop came from the ceiling directly above me. It sounded like a joist settling, but it was sharper, more energetic, almost cheerful. A laugh rendered in wood and nails. My own laughter died in my throat. I sat in silence. For the rest of the night, the laptop screen flickering in the dark room. The house learned my rhythms. It learned my habits. When I paced the living room, restless and anxious, I'd hear faint, muffled footsteps from the floor above, following my path, matching my stride. When I talked to myself, a habit of a man who lives alone, I'd hear the plumbing in the walls gurgle and groan in response, forming strange, conversational patterns. It was the mimicry that was the most unnerving. The house wasn't just making random noises, it was reflecting me. My moods, my actions, my very presence. It was a distorted mirror showing me a monstrous version of myself. My frustration was a sighing floorboard. My focus was a tapping on the glass. My sadness was a pocket of unnatural cold. My joy was a sharp crack from the ceiling. My fear, I didn't know what my fear sounded like to the house yet, and I was terrified to find out. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I'd lie awake for hours, straining to hear every tiny sound, trying to parse its meaning. Was that creak just the house settling, or was it a response to the anxious thrumming of my own heart? Was the furnace kicking on, or was the house clearing its throat? The silence I once craved was now my enemy. It was a loaded, listening silence, pregnant with the possibility of a response. My work suffered. I couldn't concentrate. I'd sit at my desk, staring at a blank screen, my ears tuned to the house instead of the task at hand. I became jumpy, a nervous wreck. A car backfiring on the distant main road would make me jolt out of my chair. The normal, comforting sounds of the house now felt like threats. I started a log, a small black notebook where I meticulously documented every incident. Date, time, what I was doing, what I was feeling, and the house's reaction. November 5th, 11:14 p.m. Felt a surge of anxiety about my finances. The light bulb in the hallway flickered 3 times, then went out. Bulb was new. November 8th, 2:30 p.m. Pacing in the office. Heard what sounded like pacing in the attic directly above me. Stopped, and the sound upstairs stopped. November 12th, 8:00 a.m. Making coffee. Whispered good morning to myself out of habit. A long, low gurgle came from the sink drain like a reply. Reading it back, it looked like the diary of a madman. Was I losing my mind? The isolation, the lack of human contact, was it finally getting to me? I considered the possibility of carbon monoxide poisoning. I bought a detector that very day, installed it, and ran a test. The reading was normal. No gas leaks. No easy explanation. I tried to fight back. I tried to control the experiment. I would sit in the living room and deliberately regulate my emotions. I would think of something happy, a memory from childhood. The house would remain quiet, almost passive. Then I would force myself to feel a pang of fear, thinking about the tapping on the window. And in the kitchen, a cabinet door would softly click shut. It was a slow, agonizing dance. The house was a passive observer most of the time, but when my emotions peaked, high or low, it would respond. It was feeding on my energy. My stress, my fear, my loneliness, they were its triggers. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, my own emotional state a weapon being used against me. Paranoia became my constant companion. I felt scrutinized. I started covering the mirrors because I couldn't stand the feeling of being watched, even by my own reflection. I'd walk through the rooms of my house and feel a tangible weight in the air, the pressure of a vast, silent attention. The house wasn't haunted by a ghost or a spirit. It was the house itself. The wood, the pipes, the foundation, the very air within its walls. It was all part of some vast, sleeping consciousness that I had somehow awakened. I thought about leaving, packing a bag and just driving away, but where would I go? Back to a tiny apartment in a noisy city, and what would I tell people? I had to leave my house because it was sighing at me. They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I was. Part of me needed to stay, to prove it, to understand it. That need was a fatal kind of pride. One night I called my sister, Sarah. I just needed to hear a normal human voice. We talked for an hour about her kids, about her job, about nothing. I forced myself to sound cheerful, normal, relaxed. "You sound good, Alex," she said before we hung up. "But are you okay? You seem a little distant." "I'm fine," I lied, my voice tight. "Just tired, work has been crazy." As I spoke that lie, the old grandfather clock in the corner of the living room, a clock that hadn't worked in the 5 years since my grandfather passed away and I'd inherited it, suddenly chimed once. A single, deep, resonant bong that vibrated through the floor. It was a sound of profound finality, a judgment. After I hung up, I stood in the silent house for a long time, the echo of tea. He chimed still hanging in the air. The house knew I was lying, and it was letting me know. The game had changed. It wasn't just reacting anymore, it was communicating. The storm was predicted for days. A massive system rolling in off the Pacific, promising gale-force winds and torrential rain. The kind of storm that makes the whole world outside your window disappear into a churning gray chaos. Normally, I loved storms. I loved being sealed inside my sturdy house, warm and safe, listening to the wind howl and the rain lash against the windows. It was the ultimate feeling of shelter. This time, all I felt was a cold, creeping dread. The idea of being trapped in this house, isolated by the weather while its awareness seemed to be growing stronger every day, was terrifying. The day the storm hit, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow-gray. The wind began to pick up, starting as a low moan through the fir trees and escalating into a furious, shrieking roar. I spent the afternoon preparing. I checked my flashlights, gathered candles and matches, and made sure my phone was fully charged. I tried to treat it like a normal power outage drill, a practical problem to be solved. But my hands were shaking. Every time the wind slammed against the house, making the frame shudder, I couldn't help but wonder if it was the wind or if it was the house, shaking with anticipation. The power went out at 8:17 p.m. One moment the living room was bathed in the warm, steady light of a lamp. The next I was plunged into a sudden, shocking darkness. The comforting hum of the refrigerator died. The low thrum of the house's electrical nervous system flatlined. The silence that rushed in was absolute, and for a second I felt a flicker of hope. Without power, maybe the house would be inert. I was wrong. The silence wasn't empty. It was watchful. I fumbled for the flashlight on the coffee table, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I switched it on, its beam cutting a shaky, nervous path through the darkness. I sat there on the couch for what felt like an hour, just listening to the storm rage outside. The wind howled like a predator. Rain hit the windows in violent, horizontal sheets, and inside, the house began to stir. It started with a whisper, a soft, airy sound from the heating vent on the floor. SSSHHHHHHHH, like a long, slow sigh. It wasn't the wind, it was inside. It was the house, breathing in the dark. I stood up, the beam of my flashlight trembling. "Hello," I whispered, my voice a pathetic, reedy thing. In response, a floorboard in the kitchen groaned, low and long, the sound of something heavy shifting its weight. My mind raced. The breaker box. It was in the basement. Maybe a breaker had just flipped. If I could get the power back on, the lights, the noise, the normality, it might push this thing back. It might make it stop. The basement. I hadn't been down there in months. It was a dark, damp space with a concrete floor and stone walls filled with old furniture and boxes. The thought of going down there in the dark made my stomach clench with fear, but the thought of staying up here in the listening darkness was worse. I made my way to the basement door, which was at the end of a short hallway off the kitchen. My flashlight beam danced over the walls, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and twist. The door was old, solid wood. It always stuck in the damp weather, and I'd usually have to put my shoulder into it to get it open. I reached for the cold, brass knob, expecting a struggle. I turned it, and the door swung inward silently, smoothly, as if it had been freshly oiled. It opened into a maw of perfect, featureless black. The house was inviting me in. My breath hitched. I pointed the flashlight down the steep, wooden stairs. They disappeared into the oppressive darkness below. "This is a bad idea," I murmured, the words feeling small and useless against the roar of the storm. I took the first step. The wood creaked loudly under my weight. From the darkness below, a second creak answered me, as if someone had stepped onto the bottom stair at the exact same time. I froze, my foot hovering. My entire body went rigid. I swept the flashlight beam across the basement floor below. Nothing, just boxes, an old workbench, the hulking shape of the furnace. Empty. It had to be an echo, a trick of the acoustics in the stairwell. I forced myself to take another step. Creak. And from below, creak. It was mimicking me, a perfect, instantaneous echo of my own footsteps coming up from the darkness to meet me. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a direct, deliberate act. This was the house playing with me. My carefully constructed courage crumbled into dust. I turned and scrambled back up the 2 steps I had descended, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I slammed the basement door shut. The latch clicked into place. I stood there, panting, my back pressed against the wood, as if I could hold whatever was down there at bay through sheer force of will. Then I heard it, from the other side of the door at the bottom of the stairs, the sound of a lock turning, a heavy metallic thunk, a deadbolt I didn't even know was on that door. I grabbed the knob and twisted. It wouldn't budge. I rattled it, threw my shoulder against the door, but it was solid, immovable. It hadn't locked me out. It had locked something in. A wave of nausea and terror washed over me. I stumbled back into the living room, a wild, cornered animal. I had to get out of the house, now. I ran to the front door, my flashlight beam bouncing crazily off the walls. I fumbled with the locks, my fingers clumsy and useless. I finally got them undone and pulled the door open. A wall of wind and rain hit me, tearing the door from my grasp and slamming it shut again. And then I heard the deadbolt slide home with a loud, definitive click. I was locked in. Panic, pure and undiluted, took over. I was trapped. The house had me. I spun around, sweeping the flashlight beam across the room. Everything looked wrong, distorted. The furniture seemed to crouch in the shadows. The familiar space of my living room felt alien and hostile. The TV screen across the room flickered to life. Not with a picture, but with a screen of pure, hissing static. There was no power. It was impossible. The sound filled the room, a deafening, abrasive roar. S-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H. And the static wasn't steady. It was pulsing. It was pulsing in perfect time with the frantic, terrified drumming of my own heart. The house was showing me my own fear. It was broadcasting it back at me. I clapped my hands over my ears, but I couldn't block it out. The sound was inside my head. The entire house seemed to vibrate with it. I fell back against the wall, sliding down to the floor, my body shaking uncontrollably. And then the final violation. I was curled up on the floor, gasping for air, tears of terror streaming down my face. I was making these awful, choked, sobbing sounds, a guttural expression of pure despair. From the walls around me, a low hum began. It started subtly, but it grew in volume and intensity. A deep, resonant frequency that vibrated through my bones, through the floor, through the very air. And it had a rhythm. It was the same broken, hitching rhythm of my own sobs. The house was crying with me. The light fixtures rattled. The window panes vibrated in their frames. The floorboards hummed. My entire world, the physical structure I was trapped inside, was weeping in a monstrous, amplified mockery of my own agony. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was the house. And it had finally learned to perfectly mirror my deepest, most primal emotion. It was feeding on my terror, and it was growing stronger, its voice a symphony of my own breaking mind. I closed my eyes and screamed, and the humming of the house rose to match my scream. And in that moment, I couldn't tell where I ended and the house began. I don't know how long I lay there. The next thing I remember is a sliver of pale morning light cutting through the window. The storm had passed. The house was silent. The TV was off. The air was still and cold. I felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the terror. Every muscle in my body ached. I pushed myself up, my movements stiff and clumsy. The front door was unlocked. I turned the knob and it swung open easily into the clean, rain-washed morning. The air outside smelled of wet earth and pine, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced. I didn't stop to think. I didn't pack a bag. I walked out the front door, leaving it wide open. I got in my car, my keys still in my pocket from the day before. The engine turned over on the first try. I put the car in reverse and backed down the long gravel driveway, my eyes fixed on the house in my rearview mirror. It looked exactly the same. A simple two-story house nestled in the trees, solid, unassuming, normal. There was no sign of the nightmare that had unfolded within its walls. No scorched marks, no broken windows. It just sat there, watching me go. And as I turned onto the main road, I had the distinct and horrifying impression that it was satisfied. I drove for 10 hours straight until I reached a major city. I found a motel, paid in cash, and collapsed onto a stiff, unfamiliar bed. The room was loud. I could hear traffic from the highway outside, the rumble of an ice machine down the hall, the muffled sound of a television in the next room. I had never felt so safe. That was 6 months ago. I live in a high-rise apartment now on the 27th floor. I never let it get quiet. The TV is always on, even when I sleep. I listen to podcasts on headphones when I walk down the street. I need the constant, chaotic noise of humanity to drown out the memory of that other, more personal sound. I abandoned everything. The house, my belongings, my entire life up there. Bank eventually foreclosed on the property. I get letters about it sometimes. I throw them away unopened. I imagine a realtor showing the house to a new family, a young couple maybe, looking for their own quiet sanctuary. I wonder if the house is quiet for them. I wonder if it's waiting. I know I'm not crazy, but I also know no one would ever believe me. The trauma is a part of me now, a scar on my psyche. I overanalyze every sound. A creaking floor in my office building sends a jolt of ice through my veins. A gurgling pipe in my apartment wall makes me freeze, listening for a response. The fear is a phantom limb. I feel its presence constantly. The worst part is the unanswered question. Why? Why did it start after 7 years of perfect, peaceful silence? Was it me? Did my loneliness, my isolation, my quiet desperation somehow seep into the floorboards and wake it up? Did I create the monster that tormented me? Or was it always there, sleeping, waiting for a mind quiet enough to listen, and a soul lonely enough to answer back? I'll never know. All I know is that some nights when the city outside finally quiets down to a low, distant hum, I lie in bed and I focus on the rhythm of my own breathing. In and out, in and out. And I listen to the silence of my small, sterile apartment. I listen. And I pray to a God I don't believe in that I don't hear anything breathing back.